They thought she didn't belong. They watched her every move, filed complaints, and then called the cops. What they didn't know was that the woman they targeted ran the entire sheriff's department. Imagine buying the home you've worked your whole life for, finally turning the key, expecting peace, only to realize that the welcome mat isn't really out for you. That was the reality for Sheridan Cole, a 44-year-old woman who had spent over 2 decades serving her county. She wasn't just a professional. She was the county's elected sheriff, respected by colleagues and feared by criminals. But to the neighbors on Maple Glen Drive in Brookhaven Estates, Florida, none of that mattered the moment she pulled her moving truck up to her new driveway. The sun was brutal that Saturday morning. The air shimmered above the blacktop as Sheridan stepped out in jeans and a t-shirt, her hair tied back, sleeves rolled up. She looked at the small 2-story brick home with its neat lawn and tall oak tree shading the corner. It was exactly what she had wanted. Quiet, comfortable, somewhere she could finally relax after years of chasing warrants, late-night raids, and courtroom testimony. As she carried boxes from the truck, she noticed blinds twitching. People were watching. Across the street, a man watering his lawn paused, hose still running, staring longer than was polite. On the porch next door, a woman leaned against the railing, phone in hand, whispering into it while never looking away from Sheridan. Sheridan felt it, eyes tracking her every move. Guess introductions can wait, she muttered to herself, shifting the weight of the box. She wasn't naive. She'd seen that look before, when she walked into certain restaurants in uniform, when she responded to calls in neighborhoods where her authority was quietly questioned before she even spoke. But she told herself this was different. This was her home now. By noon, the moving truck was empty, and Sheridan sat on the tailgate, drinking water. Sweat dripped down her temple, but she felt a small satisfaction. She had done most of the lifting herself. That was her way. No shortcuts, no excuses. She glanced around again. Most neighbors had disappeared indoors, but the blinds still shifted whenever she looked up. The first person to speak was an older man walking his dog. He slowed as he approached, tugging gently on the leash. "You moving in here?" he asked, his voice flat. "Yes, sir," Sheridan said, standing and offering a polite smile. "Name's Sheridan Cole. Just got the keys this week." The man didn't smile back. He gave a small nod, muttered, "Welcome," and kept walking. Sheridan exhaled, watching him disappear down the street. Later that afternoon, a white SUV rolled up. Out stepped Clifford Branson, a man in his late 50s with neatly combed silver hair and a golf shirt tucked too tightly into khakis. His handshake was firm, but his eyes never quite warmed. "I'm Clifford," he announced. "President of the HOA here. Thought I'd stop by to, make sure you had everything you needed." "Appreciate that," Sheridan said evenly. "Still settling in, but I'll get there." Clifford's eyes scanned her yard, the driveway, the recycling bin near the curb. "We like to keep things in order around here. Bins out no earlier than 6 p.m., the night before collection. Lawns cut weekly." Things like that. Sheridan caught the subtext. It wasn't a welcome. It was a warning. "Understood," she replied. He gave a tight smile, patted the hood of her car like it was his own, and left without another word. Sheridan stood there, arms crossed, feeling the weight of the encounter. She had dealt with men like him before, the type who spoke softly but carried rules like weapons. That night, unpacking boxes in her living room, Sheridan thought about her new neighbors. She wanted to believe things would settle once people realized she was just another homeowner who paid her dues like anyone else. But in the pit of her stomach, she knew the stares and clipped conversations weren't just curiosity. She pulled back the curtain, looking at the street lined with identical houses, trimmed hedges, and parked SUVs. From across the way, she caught sight of the same woman from earlier, still standing on her porch, still staring. Sheridan let the curtain fall. "Some folks don't need a reason," she whispered. "They'll find one anyway." She turned off the light, convincing herself tomorrow would be better. But the truth was, tomorrow would only dig the first cracks into the foundation of her new life here. The next morning, Sheridan woke early. Years of law enforcement had wired her body to rise before dawn. She brewed coffee, stepped onto her porch, and let the cool morning air hit her face. For a brief moment, she thought maybe she had overreacted the day before. Maybe the stares were nothing more than curiosity about a new neighbor. But then she noticed the same man with the dog, this time crossing the street deliberately slower, his head turning just enough to glance at her house before looking away. A silver sedan rolled past, its driver slowing down more than necessary, peering through the passenger window. Sheridan raised her coffee cup in a small gesture of acknowledgement, but the driver quickly accelerated. Inside, she set her cup down and muttered, "Yep, still a show." By 7, she was in uniform, preparing to head into the sheriff's office. Her badge caught the light as she pinned it, a routine that usually gave her confidence. Yet this morning, as she adjusted her belt, she wondered what her neighbors would think seeing her leave the driveway dressed like that. She grabbed her keys and stepped outside. Sure enough, across the street, 2 women stood near a mailbox, speaking in hushed tones that stopped abruptly when Sheridan locked her car. Their eyes followed her until she drove out of sight. Later that day, when she returned, her neighbor from next door, the woman who had been on the porch with her phone, was outside trimming her hedges. Sheridan waved politely. "Afternoon," Sheridan called. The woman paused, holding the clippers midair. She replied without looking up and resumed clipping. Sheridan stood there for a second before heading inside. She'd seen enough body language in interviews to know when someone didn't want to engage. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the houses, Sheridan sat at her dining table surrounded by half-unpacked boxes. She heard voices drifting through her open window, neighbors chatting just loud enough to carry. "I don't know, she's always leaving before sunrise. And back late at night. I mean, what does she even do? Could be anything. People don't just keep hours like that unless something's off." Sheridan closed the window, her jaw tightening. She had heard worse in her career, but hearing it outside her own home felt different. She wanted to step outside, announce herself, tell them she was Sheriff Sheridan Cole of Seminole County. But she held back. She didn't owe anyone an explanation for her life. 2 days later, while unloading groceries from her car, a teenager from down the street stopped and asked bluntly, "Are you renting or buying?" "Buying," Sheridan replied. The boy nodded like he had gathered intel, then jogged off to a group of friends waiting at the corner. Sheridan shook her head. "Guess word spreads fast around here." The tension grew more noticeable when she realized nobody had come by with a pie. No one had dropped off a "welcome to the neighborhood" card. Not even the polite but shallow gestures common in suburban communities. Instead, she got side glances, cut-off conversations, and the constant feeling of being monitored. One night, a squad car rolled slowly past her house. Sheridan happened to be outside with her trash. The officer behind the wheel spotted her, hesitated, then gave a quick wave before driving off. Sheridan frowned. There was no reason for a patrol to circle this cul-de-sac. She knew her deputy's routes. That wasn't one of them. Back inside, she sat at the kitchen counter, tapping her fingers on the granite. Something was brewing. She had seen this progression before, in neighborhoods where gossip turned into suspicion, suspicion into complaints, and complaints into something worse. Why should home feel like work? She asked herself quietly. For years, she had carried the burden of calming disputes, solving crimes, and standing tall under scrutiny. All she wanted now was to come home and be plain old Sheridan, but it was clear her neighbors weren't going to allow that. The small signs piled up, cars slowing near her driveway, a pair of men she didn't recognize standing at the corner, pointing at her house before walking away. Her recycling bin nudged just slightly out of line, like someone had checked to see what she tossed out. By the end of the week, Sheridan sat in her living room, uniform draped over the chair, and whispered, "They want a story about me. They'll make one if they don't get it." She wasn't afraid. She had faced worse in alleys, motels, and courtrooms. But there was something more personal about this. This wasn't a case she could clock out from. This was her sanctuary, and it was being chipped away piece by piece. But the neighbors weren't done. The whispers were about to reach the HOA president, and once Clifford Branson got involved, the situation would shift from quiet suspicion to calculated action. Clifford Branson prided himself on keeping Brookhaven Estates orderly. He was the type of man who measured his lawn stripes like they were military drills, who wrote reminders on his calendar about fertilizer schedules, who believed that if you kept the neighborhood controlled, you could keep it respectable. To him, rules weren't just guidelines. They were the armor that protected the image of the community. When the first call about Sheridan landed on his desk, well, technically his email inbox, he didn't think much of it. The message was short. "There's a woman at 1432 Maple Glen who comes and goes at strange hours. Don't know what she's up to. Might want to keep an eye." Clifford leaned back in his office chair, staring at the words. He had heard of Sheridan's arrival, of course. Everyone had. New faces were rare in Brookhaven Estates. The HOA board liked to know exactly who was moving in, where they worked, what they drove, and how they kept their yard. But what unsettled Clifford wasn't the new homeowner herself. It was the tone of the message. He could tell the sender wasn't just curious. They were suspicious. By the next week, 2 more complaints arrived. One neighbor claimed Sheridan parked her car facing the wrong direction overnight. Another said she had too many packages dropped at her doorstep. Clifford knew these weren't violations worth serious attention, but he filed them anyway. Paper trails mattered. At the monthly HOA meeting in the clubhouse, the issue came up. Clifford tapped the stack of printed emails against the table while 6 other board members sat around sipping coffee. "We've had some notes about the new resident at 1432 Maple Glen," he began. His tone was casual, but his eyes scanned the room to see who leaned forward. A woman named Patricia Nolan, treasurer of the HOA, pursed her lips. "That's the one with the early morning departures, right? I've noticed. Always leaving before sunrise, coming back after dark." Another board member, Ronald Pierce, shook his head. "Probably just works long hours. Why's that our business?" Patricia's voice sharpened. "Ronald, people are concerned. We have children playing outside, strangers moving in and out at odd times. It unsettles folks." "She lives there alone," Clifford added. "No family, no kids, no spouse that I can see." "Just her." A murmur rippled around the table. In a place like Brookhaven Estates, that was information that mattered. People here liked neat categories: husbands, wives, kids, retirements. A single woman living alone didn't fit the picture. Ronald raised a hand. "What actual rule has she broken?" Patricia leaned forward. "Rules aren't the point. Perception is. When neighbors feel uneasy, it becomes our responsibility to address it." Clifford nodded slowly. He didn't need much convincing. He had made a career out of responding to concerns, even if those concerns were nothing more than gossip wrapped in polite language. "We'll keep an eye," he concluded. "Document anything unusual. If it continues, we'll decide on next steps." After the meeting, Clifford walked to his car, feeling the quiet buzz of authority settle in his chest. He liked being the person others turned to when something didn't fit. He wasn't just running an HOA. In his mind, he was safeguarding a standard. That evening, he drove past Sheridan's house. Her lights were on, shades drawn. Her car sat in the driveway, dust still on the tires from what looked like a long day. Clifford slowed, studying the home like an inspector. Nothing out of place. Yet he felt the pressure of those complaints like weight in his pocket. The next morning, Clifford received another message. This time it wasn't anonymous. It was signed by Patricia herself. "Saw her again at 5:30 a.m., heading out. No one with regular jobs leaves that early. People are talking." Clifford rubbed his temple. He told himself he wasn't acting out of prejudice. He told himself this was just due diligence. But deep down, he knew the truth. Sheridan's presence had stirred a discomfort in the neighborhood that had little to do with trash bins or parking rules. A few days later, Sheridan spotted Clifford standing across the street with Patricia, clipboard in hand. They weren't subtle. They pointed at her driveway, scribbled notes, whispered. Sheridan, arms crossed, leaned against her car and watched them until they noticed. Neither waved. They simply walked away. That night, Sheridan called her friend and deputy, Rafael Ortiz, venting her frustration. "They're circling me like I'm some kind of suspect," she said. "You want me to pay them a visit? Drop a hint?" Rafael asked, half joking. "No, that's exactly what they'd expect me to do. Throw my badge around. I just wanted a house, Raf. Just a place where I could drink coffee without someone clocking what time I walk out the door. There was silence on the line before Raphael said, Sure, people like that don't need a reason. They'll invent one. Sheridan sighed. She knew he was right. Still, she hoped Clifford's clipboard would stay just that. A clipboard, not a weapon. But Clifford wasn't finished. The whispers in his ear were about to push him into making a call that would turn suspicion into confrontation. By the second week, Sheridan had almost gotten used to the staring. Almost. She told herself not to take it personally, but it wore on her. Every time she walked to her car before sunrise, she caught the faint glow of a neighbor's window. When she returned after long shifts, garage lights flicked on as though her presence had triggered alarms. So when she found the envelope taped to her front door one Thursday evening, she already had a sense of what it might be. She pulled it down, peeled the tape carefully, and read. Notice of violation. Trash receptacles may not be left in public view outside of scheduled collection hours. Please ensure compliance. Sheridan stared at the paper, lips parting in disbelief. Her bin had been on the curb for less than an hour after pickup. It was a minor detail, barely worth a reminder, let alone a formal violation notice. She walked inside and tossed the paper on the counter. Guess the welcome basket's not coming, she muttered. Later that night, she called her older sister Gwendolyn Tate, who lived in Jacksonville. Gwen had always been the one to give her blunt advice. They gave you a violation for trash cans? Gwen asked, laughing bitterly. Sherry, that's not about trash. That's about you. Sheridan leaned back in her chair, holding the phone against her ear. I know, but the way they did it. No knock on the door, no conversation, just paperwork taped to my house like I'm already guilty. You think Clifford sent it himself? Has to be. He's the one who came by on day one with his clipboard of rules. Gwen was quiet for a beat before saying, Don't let them push you. You've fought tougher battles than this. Yeah, Sheridan admitted. But I can't arrest my neighbors for side-eye. The next morning, Sheridan noticed Clifford pacing near her yard as she loaded her car. She decided to address it directly. Mr. Branson, she called out. He turned, plastering on a polite smile. Miss Cole, everything all right? I got your notice. Clifford adjusted his glasses, feigning innocence. Oh, those are standard, nothing personal, just keeping the neighborhood consistent. Sheridan tilted her head. You mean to tell me you drove around after collection day and my house was the only one with a bin out? Clifford cleared his throat. Well, yours was most visible. Sheridan stepped closer, her tone even but sharp. Mr. Branson, I've been enforcing laws for 20 years. I know the difference between a rule and a target. Which one is this? For a flicker of a second, Clifford's composure faltered, but he quickly recovered. Just the rules, Ms. Cole, nothing more. He tapped his clipboard and walked away, as if his word ended the conversation. Sheridan watched him go, every muscle in her shoulders taut. That weekend, another envelope appeared. This one claimed her car tires had slightly touched the grass edge, which was a violation of property standards. Sheridan laughed when she read it, but there was no humor in the sound. By Monday, whispers around the block grew louder. While Sheridan unloaded groceries, she overheard Patricia Nolan speaking to another neighbor in her driveway. I told Clifford we can't ignore it. She comes and goes at all hours, doesn't even try to fit in. The other woman replied, You think she's renting? Maybe that's why she doesn't care. Sheridan slammed her trunk shut louder than necessary, making them both jump. She carried her bags inside without a word. That night, as Sheridan sat with paperwork spread across her table, her phone buzzed. It was Raphael. Sure, I'm hearing things, he said. What kind of things? Word around the neighborhood association is that calls are coming in about you. Some of them vague, some of them... He paused. Some of them painting you like you're hiding something. Sheridan exhaled slowly. Hiding what? I've got a badge, a mortgage, and a bad back from moving boxes. What more do they need? Doesn't matter. Raphael replied. Once people decide you don't belong, they'll bend facts until they fit. Sheridan rubbed her forehead. She wanted to scream, but she knew her silence would say more than words ever could. The next day, another notice came, this one about lights left on too late at night. Sheridan crumpled it in her fist. She realized then that it wasn't about violations. It was about building a file. Clifford wasn't just keeping notes. He was building a case, line by line, waiting for the moment he could escalate. But Sheridan didn't know yet how far Clifford was willing to go, or how quickly the whispers would turn into a phone call that brought squad cars straight to her doorstep. The fourth notice arrived in Sheridan's mailbox on a Tuesday morning, folded neatly in the HOA envelope with Clifford's stamped signature at the bottom. This time, the violation claimed her mailbox needed repainting to meet community standards. Sheridan stared at the paper until her coffee went cold. The mailbox was less than 6 months old, spotless, black enamel shining in the sun. She walked outside, looked at it, and shook her head. It was pristine. She knew then. There wasn't even an attempt to disguise the harassment anymore. That evening, Sheridan parked her cruiser in her driveway after a long day at the sheriff's office. The flashing red and blue of her dash lights reflected against the garage door as she shut them off. She wanted the neighborhood to see it, to understand exactly who they were targeting. But within hours, Clifford's phone buzzed. Patricia Nolan's number lit up his screen. "Cliff, she brought a squad car into the neighborhood," Patricia hissed. "Do you think that's appropriate? People are nervous. It looks like she's trying to intimidate us." Clifford sat back in his recliner, sipping from a tumbler of bourbon. "It's her work vehicle," he replied, though his tone was cautious. Still, it makes a statement. By the end of the week, Clifford had 3 more calls about Sheridan. One neighbor said they saw strangers visiting her house, though it was just Raphael dropping off takeout. Another complained about her porch light being too bright. And Patricia, always the most vocal, insisted Sheridan was creating a hostile atmosphere by glaring at people. Clifford gathered the complaints into a manila folder. He stared at the growing pile, uneasy but oddly satisfied. This was what he excelled at: documentation, structure, order. Yet something inside him whispered that he was being used, that this wasn't about rules, but resentment. Still, he pressed forward. On Friday evening, Sheridan caught Clifford standing across the street again, phone in hand. She decided she was done with silent tolerance. "Mr. Branson," she called, crossing her lawn. "You got a problem with me?" Clifford lowered his phone. "Not at all, Ms. Cole, just doing my duty as HOA president." "Funny," Sheridan shot back. "Your duty seems to start and end at my house." Clifford's smile was thin. "We hold everyone to the same standard." Sheridan took a step closer. Her voice stayed calm, but her eyes locked on his. "Let me make something clear. I've lived a life where every decision I make gets scrutinized. I've walked into rooms where people thought they knew who I was before I even spoke. But I don't expect to deal with that when I'm home. So if you've got something to say it to my face, not through notices taped to my door." Clifford's throat bobbed, but he didn't respond. He simply turned and walked away, tapping on his phone as he did. Inside her house, Sheridan paced the kitchen. She could feel the tension thickening, like storm clouds gathering. The notices weren't about bins or lights or mailboxes. They were laying groundwork. She knew it. 2 nights later, at the HOA clubhouse, Clifford unfolded Sheridan's file on the table in front of the board. Patricia sat eagerly at his side, while the others looked uneasy. "We have a pattern," Clifford said, sliding the papers across. "Odd hours, repeated violations, confrontational attitude. I've had multiple residents tell me they feel unsafe." Ronald Pierce frowned, tapping the papers. "Unsafe? She hasn't done anything threatening." "You're stretching," Cliff Patricia cut in. "Ronald, you didn't see the way she stormed across the lawn the other day. She has a temper. And the police car? It makes people think she's using her position to intimidate us." Another board member, Marjorie Hill, crossed her arms. "Or maybe she just works in law enforcement." "Because that's exactly what she does." Clifford raised a hand. "Let's keep emotions out of this. The fact is, perception matters as much as reality. If enough residents feel alarmed, we can't ignore it." There was a pause before Patricia leaned in, her voice low and persuasive. "Cliff, if you won't act, someone else will. And if this community loses faith in the HOA, It reflects on you. Clifford stared at the file. His jaw tightened. He knew Patricia was pushing him, but the pressure worked. He had built his image around being the man who solved problems before they spread. In his mind, doing nothing wasn't an option. That night, Clifford sat in his car outside Sheridan's house, engine idling. He dialed a number he never thought he'd use for a neighbor. "Non-emergency dispatch," a voice answered. "Yes," Clifford said carefully. "I'd like to report some suspicious activity in my neighborhood. A resident who's been causing concerns." As he gave the address, his stomach twisted, but he didn't stop. He ended the call, gripping the steering wheel, convincing himself he was protecting order. Inside her house, Sheridan sat at her dining table, filling out reports. Her porch light glowed, her cruiser parked firmly in the driveway. She had no idea that in less than an hour, squad cars would roll into her street. Not for a burglary, not for a fight, but for her. But when those flashing lights filled Brookhaven Estates, Sheridan's neighbors would learn a truth they hadn't imagined. The woman they had profiled wasn't just a target. She was the sheriff. The first sign was the glow of red and blue bouncing off the windows. Sheridan looked up from her dining table, pen still in her hand. She thought at first it was a routine patrol car cutting through, but the lights didn't pass. They stopped. Then another set appeared, and another, until her street was awash with color. She rose slowly, chair scraping against the tile, and pulled back the curtain. 3 squad cars lined the curb in front of her house. Doors opened, radios crackled, and uniformed officers stepped out, hands resting on their holsters. Sheridan muttered under her breath, "You've got to be kidding me." She unlocked the front door and stepped onto her porch. The officers froze. One of them, Deputy Lauren McKinney, squinted, recognition dawning. "Sheriff," she called, disbelief thick in her voice. Sheridan folded her arms. "Evening, Deputy. Mind telling me why half the precinct's parked outside my driveway?" The other deputies exchanged looks. A young officer, clearly nervous, stepped forward. "We, got a call about suspicious activity at this address. Dispatch said there were concerns about possible criminal behavior." Sheridan raised an eyebrow. "Criminal behavior? At my house?" "Yes, ma'am," the young officer stammered. "Resident leaving at odd hours, possible traffic in and out, that sort of thing." Sheridan tilted her head, her tone sharp but calm. "Did the caller mention the resident's name?" "No, ma'am. Just the address." McKinney cleared her throat, embarrassed. "Sheriff Cole lives here," she told the younger officer firmly. The words hung heavy in the humid night. Neighbors had gathered at their windows, silhouettes visible behind curtain. Patricia Nolan stood boldly on her porch, phone in hand, watching like she was tuning into live television. Sheridan stepped down from her porch, meeting her deputies in the middle of her lawn. Her badge glinted under the flashing lights. "I'm going to say this once," she said, voice carrying across the street. "If you get a call about suspicious activity here again, you will check your system and remember whose house this is before sending half the department to embarrass yourselves." The young officer swallowed hard. "Yes, Sheriff." She turned slightly, her eyes locking on Clifford Branson, who had emerged from his home down the block, trying to look casual as he pretended to check his mailbox. Sheridan's voice sharpened. "And tell dispatch to make a note. These calls aren't about crime. They're about neighbors who can't mind their business." McKinney nodded quickly. "Understood, Sheriff. We'll clear out." The deputies returned to their cars, faces flushed with humiliation. Engines rumbled to life, one by one, until the lights dimmed and the street returned to darkness. But the air was still charged, every eye in Brookhaven Estates glued to Sheridan. She turned slowly, sweeping her gaze across the houses. She didn't need to shout to make her point. She just stood there, arms crossed, letting the silence work in her favor. Finally, Patricia muttered something into her phone and slipped inside her house. Clifford retreated too, his shoulders hunched. Sheridan exhaled, heading back to her porch. Raphael called almost immediately. "Cher, I just heard dispatch send cars to your address. You okay?" "I'm fine," she replied, though her voice carried steel. "But my neighbors? They just made a mistake they won't forget." "What happened?" They sent cops to my house, Raph. My house. On a bogus call, Raphael cursed under his breath. You want me to come over? No, I handled it. But tomorrow morning I'm filing a report. I want a record of this nonsense. She hung up, standing in her living room, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She'd faced armed suspects, riots, courtrooms stacked against her. But this was different. This was betrayal not from strangers, but from the very community she had sworn to serve. Sheridan poured herself a glass of water, her hands steady, despite the fire in her chest. She knew what would happen next. The HOA would scramble. Some neighbors would apologize, others would dig in deeper. But no matter how they spun it, they had crossed a line. But Sheridan hadn't even seen the full fallout yet. The embarrassment of that night would ripple into an HOA showdown that would split Brookhaven Estates right down the middle. The morning after the squad cars left, Brookhaven Estates felt different. People weren't just glancing anymore. They were gawking. Sheridan could feel the shift in the air as she walked down her driveway to collect her mail. Whispers trailed behind her like shadows. By mid-afternoon, her phone buzzed with an email. HOA special meeting, mandatory attendance. The subject line was bold, urgent. She clicked it open. The board had called for a meeting that evening at the clubhouse to address recent events and community concerns. Sheridan smirked. They want a show? I'll give them one. When she arrived, the clubhouse was already buzzing. Folding chairs lined the room, every seat filled with neighbors leaning forward in anticipation. Clifford Branson stood at the front, his clipboard perched on the podium like a shield. Patricia Nolan sat to his right, arms folded smugly across her chest. Sheridan stepped inside wearing her full uniform. The room fell silent. Her boots struck the linoleum floor with a steady rhythm as she walked straight to the front row. Clifford cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming. We've had troubling developments. Multiple residents have expressed concerns about irregular activity at one particular residence. Last night, law enforcement was dispatched to address those concerns. For the good of the community, we need to discuss appropriate action moving forward. Patricia leaned into her microphone. We can't have our neighborhood turned into a spectacle. Safety comes first. From the back, a voice called out, What spectacle? Those were cops showing up to the sheriff's house. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Sheridan rose to her feet, her uniform commanding attention. That's right, she said, voice steady but firm. Sheriff Sheridan Cole, Seminole County. The woman you all decided was suspicious enough to call the police on. Gasps broke out. Clifford's face went pale. Patricia's lips parted, stunned into silence for once. Sheridan took a step closer to the podium. Do you have any idea how humiliating it was for my deputies to be sent to their boss's house on a bogus call? Do you have any idea what that says about this neighborhood? Clifford tried to interject. Miss Cole, please. It's Sheriff Cole, she cut in sharply. And let's be clear, those calls didn't come from concern for safety. They came from bias. I leave for work early because crime doesn't wait for daylight. I come home late because I'm in courtrooms and interrogation rooms fighting for justice. But instead of knocking on my door, instead of welcoming me, you all whispered behind blinds and made me a target in my own home. The room was tense, every eye fixed on her. Patricia finally found her voice. We were just doing our duty to protect the community. Protect the community? Sheridan's voice rose, raw with emotion. From what? From me? I've spent 22 years protecting this county, and yet here I am, standing in front of people who called the cops on me because I didn't fit your picture of what belongs. Ronald Pierce, sitting on the board, spoke up. She's right. This has gone too far. If we're calling the police on our own sheriff, maybe the problem isn't her. Maybe it's us. A murmur of agreement spread through part of the room, while others shifted uncomfortably. Clifford's grip on his clipboard tightened. Sheridan softened her tone, letting the weight of her words settle. Look, I didn't move here to wear a badge in my driveway. I moved here because I wanted peace, just like you. But what happened last night was bigger than me. It showed how quickly assumptions can escalate when no one bothers to see the full picture. She scanned the room, her gaze meeting faces that quickly turned away. You don't have to like me. You don't even have to talk to me. But you will respect the fact that I live here, and I will not tolerate being treated like a criminal in the very place I come home to sleep." Silence filled the room. Clifford cleared his throat again, but the authority had slipped from his voice. "We'll reconsider the matter," he muttered. Sheridan leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked on him. "Do that. Because next time, it won't just be embarrassing for you. It'll be a lawsuit." With that, she turned, her uniform gleaming under the fluorescent lights, and walked out. The clubhouse doors shut behind her with a heavy thud. Neighbors sat stunned, some whispering apologies under their breath, others refusing to meet each other's eyes. Patricia whispered furiously to Clifford, but for once, he didn't respond. Outside, Sheridan inhaled deeply, her chest rising with both anger and relief. She had revealed who she was, and there was no taking it back. But the fallout had only begun. Divisions were about to crack wide open, and Brookhaven Estates would never look the same again. For days after the clubhouse confrontation, Brookhaven Estates felt like it was holding its breath. Sheridan noticed the change immediately. Some neighbors who once avoided her eyes now offered stiff nods when she passed. Others turned their backs entirely. The neighborhood had been fractured, and every driveway, every porch, every mailbox carried a new layer of tension. On Saturday morning, Sheridan stepped out to grab her newspaper and saw Patricia Nolan standing across the street with two other residents. Their voices carried easily in the humid air. "She embarrassed the entire board," Patricia said sharply. "Marching in there in uniform, acting like she's above the rules." One of the men beside her muttered, "Above the rules? She is the sheriff. You really want to pick a fight with law enforcement?" Patricia bristled, crossing her arms. "It's about fairness. If we let her slide, what message does that send? We're supposed to have standards." The other neighbor shook his head. "Standards?" Clifford called the cops on the county sheriff. "That wasn't standards. That was stupidity." Sheridan let them argue, not bothering to interrupt. Their division was evidence enough of how deep the wound had cut. Later that week, the HOA called another meeting, this time packed tighter than before. Ronald Pierce sat at the board's table, his voice carrying more authority than Clifford's as he tried to calm the crowd. "Let's get one thing straight," Ronald said firmly. "Sheriff Cole hasn't broken any laws, and frankly, I haven't seen her break a single HOA bylaw either. We need to stop turning this into a witch hunt." Patricia shot back immediately, her voice sharp. "So we're just supposed to ignore the complaints? Pretend like the community hasn't been uncomfortable since she arrived?" Marjorie Hill slammed her palm on the table. "Uncomfortable because of what? Because she leaves for work early? Because she comes home late? Patricia, you and Clifford stirred this up, and now the whole neighborhood's paying for it." The room erupted in overlapping voices. Some residents shouted that Sheridan was being unfairly targeted. Others insisted that the HOA had every right to act. Clifford sat stiff in his chair, silent, his clipboard resting unused in front of him. The authority he once wielded had slipped through his fingers. From her seat in the middle of the room, Sheridan listened. She didn't speak, not yet. She wanted them to wrestle with themselves, to hear the absurdity in their own voices. Finally, when the shouting died down, she stood. The room quieted again, eyes turning toward her. "I didn't ask for this," she said calmly. "I didn't move here to make speeches in clubhouses. I came here because I wanted to live like any of you, walk my dog, take my trash out, mow my lawn, sleep without my phone ringing. But instead, I've been watched, whispered about, and reported like I'm a stranger trespassing on my own porch." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "You say you care about safety? So do I. It's my job. But safety doesn't come from suspicion. It comes from trust. And right now, this neighborhood doesn't have it." A few people clapped softly, others sat stone-faced. Patricia glared daggers, but she didn't speak. Clifford lowered his eyes to his clipboard, as if the notes might shield him from her words. After the meeting, Sheridan walked out to find a small group waiting for her, neighbors who hadn't spoken to her before. A middle-aged couple introduced themselves as Harold and Denise Gardner. "We're sorry," Denise said quietly. "We should have come by when you moved in." "We didn't. And that was wrong," Harold added. "Not everyone here feels the way Clifford and Patricia do." some of us. We're glad you're here. Sheridan offered a tired smile. I appreciate that. It goes a long way, but not everyone was ready to change. 2 houses down, Sheridan caught Clifford on his porch that evening, staring at her with an expression that was harder to read. Anger, embarrassment, maybe both. Patricia still paraded her disdain openly, walking past Sheridan without a word whenever their paths crossed. The neighborhood was no longer united in whispers. It was split into factions, those who respected Sheridan and those who resented her more than ever. The HOA, once a tool for lawn care reminders and pool schedules, had become a battleground of pride and prejudice. Sheridan sat on her porch one evening, watching kids ride their bikes down the street. For a moment, she let herself feel the quiet she had been craving since moving in. But in the back of her mind, she knew it wouldn't last. Not when people like Clifford and Patricia refused to let go of their narrative. But Sheridan wasn't the type to sit back forever. The time was coming when she'd have to address the neighborhood head-on, not just as their neighbor, but as their sheriff. Sheridan had been patient. She had swallowed the petty violations, endured the stares, and even allowed herself to believe the embarrassment of the police call would force her neighbors to rethink their behavior. But weeks later, the hostility still lingered. Clifford avoided her. Patricia fueled gossip like it was oxygen, and a quiet tension hung over every block of Brookhaven Estates. One evening, after yet another awkward encounter with Patricia at the mailbox, Sheridan decided enough was enough. She wasn't just a homeowner here. She was the county sheriff. And while she had no interest in throwing her badge around to intimidate anyone, she also refused to live like a trespasser in her own house. The next morning, she called Raphael. "Raph, I'm done waiting. If I keep letting this go, they'll think they can keep chipping at me." "So what's the plan?" Raphael asked. "I'm holding a meeting. Not an HOA ambush, not some whispered gathering. A real meeting. I'm going to address this neighborhood on my terms." That Friday, Sheridan reserved the clubhouse herself. She printed flyers and slid them into mailboxes. Community Forum, hosted by Sheriff Sheridan Cole. Saturday, 7 p.m. No board approval, no HOA stamp, just her name. By the time Saturday rolled around, curiosity outweighed resentment. The clubhouse filled quickly, neighbors shifting uncomfortably in their seats, some whispering about whether this was even allowed. Clifford sat stiffly in the back row, Patricia right beside him, her lips pressed tight. Sheridan entered in plain clothes this time, jeans, button-down shirt, no badge, no gun. She wanted them to see her as a neighbor, not just as an authority figure. Still, when she walked to the front, the room went silent. "Thank you for coming," she began, her voice steady, but carrying a weight that demanded attention. "I didn't move here to make enemies. I moved here because I wanted peace. But instead of peace, I've been met with suspicion, notices, and even police at my door." She let her eyes sweep across the room. "And let's not pretend we don't know why. It wasn't about trash cans, mailboxes, or porch lights. It was about me. About what you assumed, what you whispered, and what you chose to believe without ever once knocking on my door to ask who I am." A few neighbors shifted uncomfortably. One older woman raised her hand timidly. I didn't know you were the sheriff," she admitted. "I just thought, well, people were saying things." Sheridan nodded. "That's the problem. People were saying things. And no one bothered to question if those things were true. You called the police on me without realizing the person you were calling them on was the same person responsible for keeping this county safe. Imagine how different things could have gone if I wasn't who I am. Imagine if the wrong deputy had responded, or if I had stepped outside angry instead of calm." The room grew still, the weight of her words settling in. Patricia scoffed loudly. "You're making yourself the victim. We just wanted to keep the community safe." Sheridan locked eyes with her. "Safe from what, Patricia? From a woman going to work? From someone unloading groceries? From a law enforcement officer with 22 years of service?" Patricia faltered, but stayed silent. Clifford shifted in his chair, avoiding Sheridan's gaze. Sheridan softened her tone, speaking more like a neighbor than a sheriff. "Look, I know change makes people uncomfortable. I know some of you probably didn't expect someone like me to buy a house here. But I did, and I'm not going anywhere. You can either keep seeing me as a problem, or you can see me as what I really am, a neighbor who wants the same thing you do, safety, peace. Respect. From the front row, Harold Gardner stood. She's right. We've been acting out of fear, not facts. I'm ashamed I didn't speak up sooner. Others murmured agreement. Sheridan could feel the shift. Small, but real. Not everyone was convinced, but some were beginning to see her differently. She closed with a simple statement. I'll keep serving this county. That's my oath. But here, in this neighborhood, I just want to live. The choice of whether that happens peacefully is up to you. When the meeting ended, a few neighbors came forward to shake her hand, offering apologies. Others slipped out quietly, unwilling to confront themselves. Patricia stormed off, muttering under her breath. Clifford lingered, then finally approached Sheridan. You've made your point, he said quietly. But don't think this ends overnight. Sheridan looked him in the eye. I don't need it to end overnight. I just need it to end. He gave no reply, just turned and left. Back at her house later, Sheridan sat on her porch with a glass of water, watching the sun set over Brookhaven Estates. For the first time, she felt like the ground had shifted in her favor. She knew some would never accept her, but others had begun to. That was enough to keep her standing tall, but acceptance was fragile. The neighborhood wasn't healed. It was only beginning to reckon with what it had done. And Sheridan knew the final lesson still had to be spoken out loud. The following week, Brookhaven Estates looked the same on the surface. Lawns still trimmed, sprinklers still running, SUVs parked neatly in driveways. But Sheridan could feel the difference. Some neighbors waved now. Awkward but genuine. Others kept their distance, though their stares carried less open hostility than before. On Thursday evening, she took a slow walk around the block. She passed children chalking on sidewalks, teenagers tossing a football in the cul-de-sac, and couples watering flowers. It should have felt ordinary. Instead, every glance toward her carried the memory of flashing lights, whispered suspicions, and that clubhouse confrontation. She paused at the community park bench under a tall pine tree. A few residents had gathered nearby, talking quietly. One of them, Harold Gardner, called out, "Sheriff Cole, mind if we sit with you?" She nodded, and soon Harold and his wife Denise settled beside her. Their faces were open, tired but kind. "We've been thinking a lot about what you said the other night," Denise began. "About trust." "You're right. We let gossip get louder than truth. We owe you more than an apology. We owe you better." Sheridan gave a small smile. "Apologies are a start, but change means more than words. It means asking questions before jumping to conclusions. It means remembering that safety isn't about shutting people out. It's about letting people in." Harold nodded. "Patricia and Clifford still won't admit it, but they don't speak for all of us. Some of us see you as what you are, a neighbor who deserves respect." Before Sheridan could answer, a few kids ran past laughing. One stopped, looked up at her, and said innocently, "You're the sheriff, right?" "That's me," Sheridan replied. The boy grinned. "Cool." Then he sprinted off to rejoin his friends. Sheridan chuckled softly. Sometimes the simplest recognition carried the most weight. She stood and faced Harold and Denise. "Thank you, but this isn't about me alone. What happened here is bigger than one house or one sheriff. It's about how quickly suspicion grows when people assume the worst, and how easily we forget that the person we're whispering about has a story too." That weekend, Sheridan spoke at the monthly HOA meeting again, not to confront, but to close the chapter. She didn't come in uniform this time. She wore a plain blue blouse, stood tall at the front, and spoke like someone who had earned the floor. "When I moved here, I thought I was buying peace. What I got instead was a lesson. A reminder of how fragile community really is. It doesn't take a crime to break trust. Sometimes all it takes is a rumor, a glance, a silence. But I also learned that trust can be rebuilt if people are willing to look each other in the eye and admit when they've been wrong." She let the room breathe before continuing. "You don't need to like me, but I expect you to respect me. And I expect you to respect anyone else who calls this place home, no matter what they look like where they come from, or how they live. Because if you can't do that, then no set of bylaws will ever make this neighborhood safe. Some clapped. Others stayed still. Clifford's jaw was tight. Patricia's eyes narrowed, but neither interrupted. Sheridan finished with quiet conviction. We all want the same thing. Security, peace, and a place we can truly call home. Let's not waste that by letting fear speak louder than fairness. She stepped away from the podium, leaving her words to settle where they would. That night, sitting on her porch as cicadas buzzed in the distance, Sheridan reflected on everything that had happened. The irony hadn't been lost on her, that a sheriff could be treated like a suspect in her own neighborhood. But it had taught her something valuable. That authority doesn't shield anyone from prejudice, and that real change begins not with laws, but with conversations. She raised her glass of water toward the quiet street and whispered to herself, "Home is worth fighting for." And with that, the story of Sheridan Cole in Brookhaven Estates left a final message. Assumptions destroy, but understanding builds. If this story left you thinking about your own community, remember this: respect isn't optional. It's the foundation of every